glad to welcome you to our dialogues, where I invite only truly the very best guests with whom we can discuss deep and important topics. And today I have just such a guest, Alexei Kush, an economic expert. Alexei, hello.
Yes, hello, Ruslan. Hello.
Thank you very much for coming. Today, I want us to talk about the economics of war, because the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine, which began in February 2022, has led to very serious, even unprecedented growth in military spending and significant economic consequences, not only for Ukraine and Russia and their allies, but for the entire world as well. Countries have been rapidly increasing and have increased their defense budgets, reallocating resources in favor of the military and security, and in turn have faced rising inflation, sanctions, energy shocks, and budget deficits. Just the official military budgets alone grew by nearly $560 billion during the period from 2022 to 2024. Military expenditures alone have exceeded $1 trillion. Alexei, so how does the economy function during wartime, and what economic flows does war generate? Who profits from it and who loses out? And in general, what is a war economy?
Well, a war economy, basically, you can compare it, to the abnormal way the human body functions under stress. For example, when a person finds themselves at a very high altitude, like on Everest, their pulse is high, blood pressure is elevated, and the body's internal life support systems are reconfigured to mainly concentrate oxygen for brain function, while those organs that, from a survival standpoint, are important but not critical, are essentially shut down. Well, for example, when someone spends a long time underwater, that's also an extreme situation. So here we're talking about the economy of extremes, the economy of extreme parameters and critical states. In other words, if we compare it to physiology, we could call it an urgent economy, an urgent state, where the situation could end in the patient's death at any moment. In fact, the wartime economy also in some ways resembles an urgent state, because no one knows how long the economy can function in this mode, since these are abnormal parameters for the economy, abnormal parameters for economic agents. And naturally, the question of the source of money for the war always arises here. In principle, I analyzed the Russian economy, for example, from the perspective of sources of money. There was even a recent article, a special one on this topic. And in the context of war financing, I identified three sources that countries often use to fund wars, and I call them so-called deadly gifts. Deadly gifts because although these sources seem to provide money, in the end they lead to very serious economic and financial consequences. So what are these three deadly gifts? They are financing the war, for example, through a budget deficit when the budget deficit increases sharply, financing the war by increasing government debt, and financing the war by raising taxes. So these are the three deadly gifts. You can analyze different economies in this context. Well, for example, if we look at our own economy, we'll see that the budget deficit has grown by about 15 to 20% of GDP. Well, that's very, really kind of actually, sorry.
Bless you.
Got a bit of a cold. Yes, thank you. Yes. If, 15 to 20% of GDP is a catastrophic figure because, for example, during the pandemic, our budget deficit was around 5%, and that was considered a lot. No, 5 or 6%. And usually,
U.S. debt is 100% of GDP. Others exceed 100%.
I mean, the budget deficit. The deficit, not the ratio, yes, not the ratio of government debt to GDP, but the budget deficit. But in the US right now, it's 6.5%. And that's considered a critically high figure. And Trump, by the way, has promised to reduce the budget deficit to 3% by 2028. Well, we'll see how that goes. So in general, in a normal situation, our budget deficit was about 1 to 2%, sometimes 2 to 3. So a budget deficit of 15 to 20% of GDP is a very high figure. This indicates that there is a colossal gap, a financial hole, and it has a very serious impact on all the main macroeconomic indicators. From the perspective of the debt to GDP ratio, we also see a significant increase in debt here. If before the war, our debt to GDP ratio was somewhere around 60 well at different times, it was 65, 70%, even 55%, but now it's almost 95%. And according to the International Monetary Fund's forecasts, this year in 2025, our government debt to GDP ratio will exceed 100%. This is a critical indicator. Next year, it will be around 104, 105% of GDP. So this is a kind of psychological threshold, which is very dangerous for us. Why? Well, because unlike the US, 70% of our debt is denominated in foreign currency, in euros and dollars, which we do not print. That is, the US nominates its debt in dollars, which is their own emission instrument, printed by the Federal Reserve System. In our case, 70% of the national debt is in foreign currency, which we do not print. Accordingly, this can only be covered by the foreign currency reserves of the national bank. And then there's a tax increase. We can already see that serious changes have started here. An increase in the military levy. For sole proprietors, it's 4%, well, 4% for sole proprietors and 5% for the general population. So taking into account that for the population there is an 18% income tax plus the military levy, which is a quasi-tax on income, we end up with 23%. This is essentially the base income tax when you include the military levy. For an economy like Ukraine, it's a developing economy, this is already quite a high level of taxation. So we can see that all these so-called deadly gifts for financing the war are already in use. In other words, we are financing this through the budget deficit, expanding domestic borrowing, including, well, in the first year of the war through the issuance source, and now by using the liquidity of state-owned banks to cover these domestic borrowings. And, well, the growth of the national debt is happening both through domestic borrowing and through external borrowing, including the funds we receive from our partners. And then there's the tax source. We see a significant increase in taxes for the population and for businesses. So this is also a factor that is already being used as the price of war, you could say.
And how are these huge cash flows, these new cash flows being redistributed? Where are they primarily going? If we're talking about a wartime economy, well, on the global scale, we're not really talking about $560 billion. But even the Ukrainian budget has just grown phenomenally because, for context, in 2021, that is the 21st year, not 2013, the war in Donbass was already ongoing. Crimea had already been annexed, and there was already the threat of war. Our defense budget was $5 to $6 billion. In 2022, it was already 44 billion, which is a 640% increase. And in 2023, 2024, it was at 64.7, $64.8 billion. By the way, I have something, but these are only Ukrainian expenses. According to CIPRI's estimates, taking into account the foreign weapons received, Ukraine's actual war expenditures in 2024 would have reached $125 billion. This is the fourth world budget, that is 5 and 125. This is a difference of 3 years by and large. What's interesting here, so you can understand this Mount 7, despite Russia's military might and the larger size of the country, these sums are absolutely comparable to Russia's war expenditures. Russia's budget, the amount spent on the war, its defense budget in 2024 amounted to $149 billion. So the figures are roughly comparable. There is no multiple fold advantage for Russia when it comes to war financing. But I wanted to ask, where exactly do these additional funds go first and foremost? How do they move through the economy? What stays within the country? And what gets siphoned off if we can do that kind of analysis? Because this isn't a new situation. You know, I always picture scenes from movies about medieval wars where the army is marching somewhere, and right alongside the army, there's a convoy of settlers, well, merchants, and various kinds of entertainment groups from different social strata. So there are herds of horses being driven along. A lot is being transported, depending on the campaign. Wood is being carried, various tools. All of it, the military industrial complex, the service sector, I think that since those times, very little has actually changed. If you can, could you roughly explain how this large flow of money splits into streams and smaller rivers?
Well, basically, we have two budgets. Essentially, we operate in a two-budget system. One budget is social. It's over $2 trillion. So, 2 trillion hryvnias on the military budget, which is also over 2 trillion hryvnias. So there are two budgets, each roughly around 2 trillion 300 billion, 2 trillion 400 billion hryvnias. Those are the approximate figures for both budgets. Accordingly, we have these two main areas of expenditure. The social budget is clear. It's for pensions, salaries for public sector employees, healthcare, education, infrastructure, while the military budget is naturally for military needs. And these two budgets have different sources. The thing is, we mainly earn the money for the domestic social budget ourselves. Why? At the expense of social spending. But for the military budget, it's the other way around. For the military budget, we earn the money ourselves through domestic taxes. That's the situation.
Because international organizations and governments mostly refuse to formally finance Ukraine's direct military expenses.
Yes, they refuse to let their money, for example, be used to pay the salaries of military personnel. That's why we finance the military budget from domestic revenues, while our Western partners provide us with money for the social budget. Mainly, by the way, it was the European Union that provided funds for the social budget. Although Trump often says that he spends more on Ukraine than Europe does, America actually provides more military aid. But if you look at direct budgetary support, it's mainly the European Union that provides the funds. And, well, the source of each of these budgets is about $40 billion, a little more. And the remaining part, which is lacking, ends up as a deficit. And here, in part, we attract, if we're talking about external financing, partly loans and partly grants, which do not need to be repaid and on which no interest needs to be paid. Previously, grants made up about 30 to 40% of the total pool of such external financing. Now, there are significantly fewer of them. Now, for example, more than 80% is loan financing. So, in this way, we've essentially established the main points, two budgets of 2 trillion hryvnias or more each. One is social, the other is military. The social budget is financed by our Western partners. The military budget is financed through domestic taxes. And accordingly, now, just last year, we passed a very dangerous threshold because domestic taxes were no longer enough to cover the military budget. That is, for example, if we collect up to 2 trillion from domestic taxes, That's all revenues, not just tax income, but also profits from state-owned enterprises, various other sources, government services. In other words, all domestic revenues combined, the total comes to about 2 trillion. And the military budget was already approved at about 2 trillion 400 billion hryvnias for the year. So that means there's a gap of about 400 billion hryvnias, or $10 billion. This is already the gap between domestic tax revenues and military expenditures. So naturally, where do you get these 10 billion from? You can cover them by creating a deficit that is through domestic borrowing. Basically, that's what's being done. As for external borrowing, as I already mentioned, our partners are generally opposed to it being used directly to finance military expenditures. Although there could be certain changes here as well, given that we are now reaching this critical point. So that's the situation. And a certain bifurcation point has already formed here precisely because there are no longer any domestic taxes for military expenditures. That's why this situation has arisen, and a certain bifurcation point has already formed here precisely because internal taxes are no longer sufficient to cover military expenses.
That is exactly why virtually all of Ukraine's military expenditures, despite the increase in the size of the armed forces, the ongoing war, the accumulating social burdens of war, such as the number of wounded, insurance payments, and everything else, that is why even though the war keeps adding new carriages of expenses every year, the reality is that Ukraine's military budget has hardly grown over the past 3 years. It has remained on a plateau. There are fluctuations of just a few, maybe several $billion, but there is no significant increase of 10 or 20% anymore.
Yes, and this is due to the fact that there is a certain point, or rather a ceiling for growth, determined by internal revenues and domestic taxes that can be collected, since external creditors refuse to directly finance military expenditures. For example, the International Monetary Fund will not provide a loan to cover military expenses. The European Union, for instance, will provide money for social needs, but it will not give money to pay the salaries of military personnel. So it turns out that this ceiling has been reached. Expenditures have reached the plateau of economic possibilities, and moreover, this plateau will gradually shrink because the economy itself is also gradually contracting. Now, regarding the allocation of these funds, the fact is that about 1 trillion hryvnias comes from the so-called military budget, which totals 2 trillion 400 billion. So roughly 1 trillion hryvnias is what's called monetary allowance. That is, it's the salary paid to military personnel. And to a large extent, this money goes into the banking system and serves as a very significant source of liquidity for Ukrainian banks. And banks make very good money from this because they receive what is essentially an almost entirely free resource. These are the balances that accumulate on payroll card accounts, and the banks then place this money into national bank deposit certificates, earning rates of 15, 16, or even as much as 17%. Previously, they used to earn as much as 25% per year. So banks make quite substantial profits from this. And in addition, this resource goes into the consumption sector because the families of military personnel spend this money on purchasing various goods and services. In other words, this money essentially serves as a significant driver for the domestic service and trade sector, which is also known as the tertiary sector of the economy. You can even talk to various businesses that are located in areas situated near the line of combat that is close to the front line itself. And there in those locations, I actually had the opportunity to speak directly with some business representatives. They say that there is quite actually a very high demand in the retail networks of these areas precisely because of the presence of military units. That is, the military buys a wide variety of different goods and supplies that they need for their operations, and accordingly, the businesses and companies involved in this trade are thriving there and are making quite good money from the trade that takes place. That's just how it is. And as a result, part of the money also ends up flowing into various other sectors and industry. But mostly it goes into the service sector because this money is hardly invested in the real estate market, for example, or in creating new businesses. Here, it should be noted that we are witnessing a very paradoxical economic model in wartime conditions. In fact, such a model has never existed before in history. Because the general format of what is known as a wartime or Keynesian economy is as follows. Two distinct spheres are created, or rather a binary model of the economy with two separate sectors. That is, one sector of the economy is located in the rear. It largely continues to retain the characteristics of the civilian economy. It produces goods and services used by people, and businesses keep operating. And here, the primary and most significant task of the government is to ensure as effectively as possible the transfer of profits from this, let's say, civilian sector of the economy to ensure the steady and reliable flow of investments into the economy related to the complex. Well, for example, let's say we take two economies, the Russian and the Ukrainian economies, for comparison. How do these transfers actually happen in wartime conditions? Well, in the Russian economy, a significant portion of the income that is generated from oil and gas sales then flows often indirectly in the form of various investments and different types of funding into the military industrial complex. So there is a mechanism for transferring raw material export revenues into the war economy, the military industrial complex for the production of various types of weapons, ammunition, and so on. In other words, this element of transfer does exist. For us, for example, we don't have such a direct flow, for instance, from grain export revenues because we don't have oil, but what is our export commodity? It's grain, corn, iron ore, and metal. We don't have that kind of transfer of revenues from raw material exports into funding the military industrial complex. We don't have such a transfer because we have a financial lever in the form of external aid amounting to $40 billion a year. And in fact, the government is only engaged in financial conducting, redirecting these financial flows, but there is no such channel for transferring economic revenues into industrial funding. There is no such transfer. As a result, we have, why do I say we? We in Ukraine have developed a unique, truly unique type of economy, which will even be studied in the future. And sort of, because why has there never been anything like this before? For example, during the war years, businesses in our country accumulated huge financial resources because there was nowhere to all. You simply can't take capital out of the country since there are certain restrictions, currency controls imposed by the national bank. It's very difficult to just repatriate capital to send your profits earned in Ukraine abroad. That's why, for example, business deposits here have already exceeded 1 trillion hryvnias. These are business funds and business deposits in banks. Taking into account various financial reserves that businesses have invested in different assets like securities, government bonds, cash, financial instruments, and also including balances in foreign currency accounts. For example, our businesses keep a lot of foreign currency in overseas accounts. This is what's called unreturned export revenue. For instance, an investigation showed that up to 2012, about $15 billion was the amount of withheld foreign currency revenue. This includes revenue from grain contracts as well. Overall, in total, you can estimate that businesses have more than $20 billion in free liquidity, meaning funds that are readily available and not tied up in other obligations. That's a substantial amount, $20 billion, that businesses could choose to invest, including in a variety of projects related to the military-industrial complex, as well as other potential opportunities. But this money is simply stuck somewhere, actually. As I already mentioned, the total liquidity is much higher. When we say 20 billion, we basically mean what has been accumulated as pure profit. But in total, as I already mentioned, if you include foreign accounts and deposits in Ukraine, well, deposits in Ukraine alone exceed 1 trillion hryvnias, which is about 25 to 30 billion dollars equivalent. Abroad, there's another 10 to 15 billion, plus there are various other financial instruments. So in total, businesses definitely have up to $50 billion, which they are currently in no hurry to invest in the national economy. The population follows exactly the same behavioral pattern. That is, people have accumulated more than 1 trillion hryvnias in deposits and current accounts in banks. That's also about $25 billion, plus the US dollars in cash that people have on hand. That's another several tens of billions of dollars. This is what's, well, readily available. That is somewhere too. And in addition, again, all the accounts, well, of course, the population is a bit of an overstatement, but let's say the elite have accounts abroad, where certain resources are kept. So during the war, the liquidity accumulated by the population can also be estimated at around $50 billion. In total, it turns out that businesses and the population have accumulated up to about $100 billion in various instruments. That is, these are either deposits within the country in hryvnia, dollars, or euros, or accounts abroad in foreign currency or cash or some financial instruments. So just imagine this mass of $100 billion. This isn't something that carried over from before the war. It's what has been accumulated over 3 years of war. And this money, practically not a single cent of it is being invested in the development of the military economy, the military industrial complex, new military technologies, or even in domestic government bonds, which during wartime the population and businesses are supposed to be actively buying. Even there, the money is hardly going. For example, let's say businesses hold several $1 billion in government bonds, but these are in fact relatively small amounts, really. And the population also holds about the same amount, more or less, generally speaking. So we're talking about insignificant, relatively small investments that don't play a decisive role in financing the budget deficit. But it should also be noted here that in reality, the government has done practically nothing substantial or meaningful to create financial instruments and channels for transferring this money into the military economy, because there are currently no specialized industrial or technological platforms where, for example, the population could actually invest in promising startups and innovative projects related to the production of various types of munitions, drones, different advanced technologies, and so on. So what is being offered to the population? The population is being encouraged, for example, to assemble drones in their kitchens and hand them over. People are currently being asked to donate, that is, to make charitable contributions to various causes. But all projects that are related to serious contracts, especially those that have government funding, are all closed. That is, they are all monopolized by people who have access to government funding, and as a result, others are excluded from participating. And they are all closed in nature. This is really confidential information. We're talking about how profitable this business is, how what kind of margins it has, what kind of returns. But no one, all those who are in this business, naturally, they do it based on personal connections. So the primary investment in this business is personal connections. Accordingly, this business is set up by people who are able to connect the right people with each other, and they believe that this investment is much more important than technology, finances, or anything else. That's why when they set up such a business, they don't want to take on any partners or associates, and especially not collective investors. No one wants to attract mass investors, because for mass investors, you have to disclose information and, well, you have to share things with them. That's why, as I already mentioned, the only thing they say is, oh, just send donations, which is what the general public does. But when it comes to actually taking on partners, neither the general public nor outside businesses are in any hurry, because that would mean having to share the profits that are being generated there. That's how it is. And it's also worth mentioning that during the war, a whole stratum of people has emerged who are significantly enriching themselves through this contract. And Well, we later see some of them even getting arrested. And some of this information makes its way into the press. With this money, there are people who literally during the war have become multimillionaires, financing personal art exhibitions in the center of Kiev for their wives or mistresses, giving them lavish gifts and everything else, luxury cars, apartments, mansions. Well, there's also this kind of group who basically make money off these contracts. People who shamelessly and brazenly profit in this way, I call such people Necrolords, meaning they're people who literally make money off death, because that's the kind of business it is. At its very core, let's put it this way, this isn't the kind of business where such profit should be made or even considered acceptable. But in general, what kind of corruption rent is actually formed during wartime? And can it be formed? And we are not just talking about some kind of corruption at the official level, but rather we are specifically talking about the profit margin that emerges from the ongoing interaction between business interests, the military business sector, and government officials. And why we say that $500 billion, that is $558 billion to be exact, during this period, that's the amount by which military spending has increased overall. To a large extent, this is directly related to the Russia-Ukraine war, although not entirely. What can the elites gain from this? Well, the elites can profit from it, but again, the issue is that all this information is classified, and we only see occasional leaks in the press about specific cases when, as I already mentioned, they catch the most blatant crooksters who have really gone too far or become too greedy. Well, because as I already said, this is a business where you really can't, in any realistic sense, make money in that way. I mean, it's one thing when in peacetime people are scheming with that, of course, that can also be condemned. But at least that's more of a peculiarity of national taxation, so to speak. A lot of people were involved in that, and many people had a hand in it. But at least it wasn't on military spending. At least it wasn't on blood. That's why here during wartime, as I already mentioned, is basically making money off of. Well, if we're talking about the non-blood suckers who steal from some government contracts, that's already your typical non-blood suckers, because that's taking money away from people who are risking their lives. That is, it's about soldiers or again, $1 billion hryvnias that was spent inefficiently if it had been used effectively, for example, to buy the necessary ammunition or protective gear, medical supplies, or tactical medicine. It could have saved thousands of lives. That's why, but again, it's very difficult to say exactly how much because right now it's almost impossible to assess this. But the sheer scale, well, here we are already talking about general parameters, not necessarily tied to any specific corruption flows. During the war, the population and businesses have managed to accumulate up to $100 billion. And that's despite the fact that in principle, both the population and businesses are in a very difficult situation. Well, a significant portion of the population and a significant portion of businesses. But once again, this shows us that the assessment of the Ukrainian state and economy as something extremely poor or collapsing as depleted. I don't know that assessment is fundamentally wrong. Well, it's wrong. And most importantly, it's just one-sided, because when such an assessment is given, in fact, some superficial things are simply perceived as deep-rooted processes. And those superficial things really can be quite in a difficult situation. So what we see at facade of the economy, as it appears to us today, like the budget deficit, the level of government debt, GDP, the dynamics of budget spending, extremely low GDP growth rates, inflation, these are the superficial things that, as it were, signal some kind of global, well, pre-crisis conditions. But behind this facade, there are completely different worlds, various distinct segments. This is already, let's call it the shadow bot. It's not even a shadow economy. It's more like an economy that's operating in a bunker. Because you can't really call it shadow, since a lot of this money was earned absolutely legally.
Bunker money. Of course, there are the money of the Necrolords that's there too.
Yes. But that's a minor part. Let's put it this way. 90% of it is money that was actually earned in the real economy, real income. And if there is Necrolord money, if it exists, then maybe it's just a few percent of that amount, but not a significant part. So more than 90% of it is absolutely legally earned money, because where is it all kept? In bank deposits. If it's in bank deposits, that means financial monitoring was involved. So this money, it's either the actual income of the population or it's real business income, profit that simply can't be taken out of the country. That's all there is to it. And the Necrolord money, it might be there, but as I already said, it's probably sitting somewhere in crypto most likely, or in cash. That might be maybe 2% of the total amount. But those 95, 97, 98%, that's money that could have been accumulated during wartime conditions by a portion, not the entire population, but part of the population, and not all businesses, but some businesses. But it was possible to do so. And we've just hit upon the right terminology here. I thought for a long time about what to call this, because it's not exactly official, but it's not shadow either. This is precisely what I would call a bunker economy, because this is money that is kept in a kind of financial bunker. It's business that sits in a bunker and waits for the artillery shelling to end. Well, figuratively speaking, the artillery shelling, in other words, they're waiting for the war to end so they can open up this bunker and come out with this money, with these suitcases full of cash, and naturally take it out of the country. That is to say,
because it's very difficult to take it out right now, large sums of money.
It's very difficult because all the channels for moving capital out have been blocked by the national bank. Well, naturally, some money is taken out through fake imports and various other schemes. But again, for example, many foreign companies operating here don't want to get involved with these schemes. For instance, a well-known Azerbaijani company recently bought a titanium business in Ukraine. One of the versions I've heard is that this was because they had accumulated huge profits. They can't take this profit out, exchange it for dollars, or transfer it abroad. They're afraid that inflation will simply eat up this money, so they decide to buy at least something for a huge sum, hoping that in the future they can sell it for the same dollars and somehow make up for it. In other words, they're just investing in something so they can somehow convert it later.
It's precisely this bunker money that is actually keeping the real estate market afloat, because real estate prices in Ukraine are competitive with those in Europe and many other countries, despite the war. Is this money that is also driving the growth in car purchases, for example, new cars? Yes, it's exactly them.
Yes, well, the real estate market is currently stagnant here because in the past it was mainly labor migrants, the so-called Zarobichani, who provided liquidity. The behavioral model worked like this. People would go abroad, work, save money, then buy apartments for the children in Ukraine and later open businesses in Ukraine. Now, that system no longer exists because those same labor migrants who have simply become regular refugees in Poland are now saving money, taking out Polish mortgages, buying Polish real estate, and bringing their parents and children over to Poland. But in Kyiv, yes, in Kyiv, there is still some support for the real estate market. But you're right, for example, luxury goods, expensive cars. On the streets of Kyiv, for instance, you can see the newest car models that are being released in the world. Phenomenal prices. Two cars that cost hundreds of thousands of euros or dollars. And it's not like it's just a single car that happened to drive by. You can see dozens of such cars driving through the streets in a single day. This is also that bunker money, so to speak, that exists. But the problem is that as soon as, let's say, the green light is given for capital outflow, Ukraine will face a massive outflow of capital from the country because all this money will flow out there to the West. And it's not just billions we're talking, according to various estimates, at least $15 to $20 billion. This could leave the country in the first year or the first years after the war. Naturally, the national bank will maintain currency controls here and will gradually release this accumulated pressure like water that has built up behind a dam. They will gradually open these floodgates of currency regulation and the channels for capital outflow abroad. Nevertheless, within 2 or 3 years after the war, these $15 to $20 billion will most likely leave the country. Again, why is that? Because there is no economic growth model that has been developed by the government. There is no economic development strategy, no industrial policy, no investment policy. Investors' rights are not protected. The rights of business creditors are not protected. There is no effective judicial system. There is no protection for the rights of an investor who has put in money, and they could simply lose that money at any moment. And accordingly, if all these fundamental issues still haven't been resolved and hoping that they will be resolved in the near future, well, there are practically no chances for that. Well, that means this money will just, like a whistle or say a starting pistol goes off, that's how all this money will immediately rush out just like that to the West.
Let me pose this question. Friends, viewers, forgive me for asking this, but I simply can't avoid it. I can't not ask this question because it's on the minds of many among the elite. From the perspective of the economy and the elites, is war a profitable process? Well, from a financial standpoint or not, because it turns out that despite the fact that Ukraine lost just in the first year of the war, lost 29% of its GDP, it turns out that hundreds of billions of dollars in Western aid, investments, materials and equipment that was sent here still in part ended up somehow in the hands of the elites, the population, and businesses as well. These were very unusual investments made at an absolutely terrible moment, but these were flows that were coming into Ukraine which had never come to Ukraine before. On a global scale, CIPRI itself said that wars and the increase in military spending in 2024 alone added approximately 0.5% or 0.5% to the world's GDP. Scientists, for example, or people from our military industrial complex tell me that in 30 years, we have never had such favorable working conditions, despite Russian strikes, drones, and missiles. If it weren't for the war, we would never have had this. There would be no Neptune, no missile program, no ballistic missiles, nothing at all. I'm not even mentioning drones and everything else. So is this a bad thing or a good thing? War, from the perspective of the economy, the elites, and development. Once again, I apologize for this question. I mourn every person killed and wounded in this war.
Well, look, the thing is, you're saying that it added about 0.5% to the global GDP somewhere, but unfortunately, we practically don't have that 0.5% or even 1% because after a drop of 28-29% of GDP in 2022, we had a 5% growth in 2023. But that's a recovery growth based on a low statistical comparison base. And in 2024, the growth is already at about 3.5%. And this year, the forecast is for growth at around 2%. So, in fact, even the base effect is gradually fading, being exhausted. And we see that the GDP growth rates are now extremely low. And we have 15% unemployment, whereas it used to be 20% of the economically active population. At the same time, in certain professions, there is an acute shortage of highly qualified workers. So there are a number of indicators that show the situation is once again completely abnormal, because in wartime, if the military industrial complex is developed, the economy should be growing quite actively, specifically due to government contracts, due to military orders. If the military industrial complex is functioning, but this is not reflected in the GDP growth rates, and it is not reflected in employment figures either. During wartime, the unemployment rate should be around 2%, 2.5%. This is the kind of unemployment figure you would expect during a war. If during a war, the unemployment rate is not 2%, but 15% or even 20%, this indicates that something is completely abnormal in the government's economic policy, because this simply should not be the case. Therefore, unfortunately, we don't have this, kind of convergence in economic growth that we might hope for, with government orders coming in and for the economy as a whole to receive this sort of Keynesian wartime stimulus, which, as you can see, is currently missing. So when, for example, Some officials say that our military-industrial complex is now highly developed and that it produces goods worth tens of billions of dollars annually. I always want to ask, where can this be seen statistically? Statistically, this is not visible. In our economy, we see a decrease in the share of industry within the overall structure of the economy. Industry is shrinking within the overall structure, while the service and trade sectors, on the contrary, are growing. The agrarian and raw material sector is growing. In fact, right now, more than 70% of our economy is the service and trade sector, and about 15% is the agrarian and raw material sector, while industry is now somewhere around 10 to 15%. Although before the war, it was about 20%. This is the share of GDP. Our economy is becoming, in its characteristics, a service and raw materials economy. Not an industrial one, but a service and raw materials economy. If we look at what we export, before the war, 50% of it was agrarian and raw materials exports. This was considered a very poor indicator because there were practically no complex goods in the export structure. Now, 80% of our export structure is made up of agrarian and raw materials components. And semi-finished and complex goods, well, semi-finished goods make up the remaining 20%. And as for complex goods, there are probably only 1 or 2% at most. So on the contrary, we are seeing the industrialization, a contraction, a shrinking of the industrial core. I don't see statistically these tens of billions of dollars in industrial production, where are they being generated? So it's unclear, it's not clear where these numbers are coming from. Now, regarding your main question, the thing is, during warshare we're talking, regardless of where it's happening, whether that's in Ukraine or in any other country that finds itself in the midst of conflict or war, the effects and challenges people face are often quite similar no matter the location. There are always certain groups that inevitably form, who then become the primary beneficiaries or recipients of a significant portion of the government contracts that are allocated to the military industrial sector. And they, whether consciously or unconsciously, become, let's say, participants in this process of profiting from war, because they produce things that are then bought by the government, and which, apart from the government, no one else would buy from them. Accordingly, they make quite a lot of money from this activity. That's why, especially in wartime, they usually tend to take the most radical positions in terms of continuing the war. In other words, they are typically the ones who express the most radical and uncompromising views on continuing the war. That is, they always advocate for the maximum escalation of hostilities, for prolonging the war as much as possible, because they understand that every year of war is essentially another year of business for them. That's another few $1 billion they can make. That's it. And they understand perfectly well that after the war, they won't have this kind of income anymore. Because, for example, before the war, when I met when talking with many different people who either held certain positions in various capacities, as we say, representatives of the ruling class, right? I noticed for myself that before the war, 9 out of 10 people were in one way or another involved in grain export to some extent. Well, not some people owned a share of a terminal in the port. Some had a grain elevator, others had mills, some had transshipment points, and some had transportation. One way or another, they were all involved in the grain export business. And then there was a period when a lot of people got involved in road construction, from selling crushed stone to taking on various contracts. And now, from personal conversations, I can say that many are currently engaged in one way or another with contracts related to the military-industrial complex. So, as a result, some of them take very radical positions in personal conversations, both regarding the format of the war, meaning they advocate for the maximum radicalization of the war, and regarding its duration. That is, they say that the war will last not just 1 year, but say 10 years. They say that the format of the war needs to be radicalized as much as possible, and so on and so forth. So basically, that's a position they take.